The blood-red sunset stretched across the Wyoming sky as Quentin Mills stood alone among the unmarked graves, his weathered Stetson clutched to his chest, tears carving paths down his dust-coated face. It had been exactly 1 year since he'd buried his wife and infant son, victims of the scarlet fever that had swept through Wheatland with merciless efficiency in the summer of 1878. He knelt before the simple wooden cross that marked their final resting place, running his calloused fingers over the names he'd carved himself. Elizabeth Mills, beloved wife, and Thomas Mills, cherished son. The wildflowers he'd placed last week had already withered in the unforgiving summer heat. Quentin hadn't brought new ones today. What was the point? They'd just die again, like everything else he'd ever loved in the distance, at the far edge of the small cemetery that sat on a gentle rise overlooking Wheatland, Wyoming. He noticed movement. Squinting against the dying light, he could make out a slender figure moving methodically among the unmarked graves that populated the northwestern corner of the burial ground. Curious despite his grief, Quentin replaced his hat and walked toward the stranger. As he drew closer, he realized it was a young woman. She knelt before a simple stone, one of dozens with no name or date, carefully placing bright yellow wildflowers at its base. She wore a plain dark blue dress, her auburn hair tied back with a ribbon that matched the flowers she was planting. "Evening, madam," Quentin said, stopping a respectful distance away. The woman startled slightly, turning to face him. Her eyes were the color of spring grass, set in a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a quiet serenity that made it difficult to look away. "Good evening," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. She gestured to the graves around her. "I hope I'm not intruding. These poor souls didn't seem to have anyone to remember them." Quentin studied the collection of stones. Most were just rough markers, placed when bodies couldn't be identified or when families couldn't afford proper headstones. "The forgotten dead of Wheatland. No intrusion," he said. "It's just unusual to see someone tending graves that aren't family." She smiled softly as she pressed another flower into the Wyoming soil. "Every life deserves to be remembered, don't you think? Even if we don't know their names." Something about her words struck him like a physical blow. For months, his greatest fear had been that Elizabeth and Thomas would be forgotten, that their lives would fade from memory just as surely as flowers withered in the sun. "I'm Aurora Montgomery," she offered, extending a dirt-stained hand. "I arrived in Wheatland 3 days ago." Quentin hesitated before taking her hand briefly. "Quentin Mills. I run the Lucky Strike Ranch just north of town." He hadn't introduced himself to a stranger in months, preferring to keep to himself and his grief. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Mills." Aurora returned to her work, pulling a small trowel from a basket and digging a shallow hole. "The station master told me no one tends to these graves. It seemed wrong somehow." "Why Wheatland?" Quentin asked. New people weren't uncommon in their growing town, but single women traveling alone certainly were. Aurora planted another yellow flower before answering. "I'm a teacher. The town council hired me for the new schoolhouse." She paused, looking up at him. "And you, Mr. Mills? What brings you to the cemetery this evening?" Quentin's jaw tightened as he nodded toward the other side of the cemetery. "My wife and son. Lost them both last summer to the fever." Aurora's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Mills." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft scraping of Aurora's trowel against the Wyoming soil. "Those flowers won't last," Quentin finally said. "Not in this heat." Aurora looked up, a quiet determination in her eyes. "Perhaps not. But I'll plant more when these fade. They deserve that much, don't you think? The question hung in the air as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the cemetery in deepening shades of purple and blue. "I should be getting back to town before dark," Aurora said, gathering her things. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Mills." Quentin nodded, watching as she made her way along the path that led back to Wheatland. Only after she disappeared from view did he realize he'd been staring. Something about the woman planting flowers for strangers had penetrated the armor of grief he'd worn for a year. That night, as he sat alone in the ranch house that had once been filled with Elizabeth's laughter and later Thomas's cries, Quentin found himself thinking about Aurora Montgomery and her strange mission to honor the unknown dead. It seemed pointless, yet something about her determination had stirred something within him that he thought had died alongside his family. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect Wyoming summer day. Quentin went about his chores mechanically, as he had for months, but his mind kept drifting back to the cemetery and the woman with the basket of yellow flowers. By mid-afternoon, he found himself riding into town, ostensibly to purchase supplies at the general store, though he knew his foreman had already done so earlier in the week. Wheatland was growing rapidly, thanks to the railroad that had come through 3 years earlier. The dusty Main Street boasted several new buildings since Quentin had last bothered to notice, including the schoolhouse where Aurora would soon be teaching. As he tied his horse outside the mercantile, Quentin found himself scanning the boardwalks for a glimpse of auburn hair. "Quentin Mills," boomed a friendly voice. "Twice in town in as many weeks. What's the occasion?" Sheriff Daniel Harrington approached, his silver star catching the afternoon sun. The two men had been friends since childhood, though Quentin had withdrawn from most social connections after his loss. "Just needed a few things, Dan," Quentin replied, shaking the sheriff's hand. "Glad to see you in town. Been worried about you up there all alone." The sheriff lowered his voice. "It's been a year, Quentin. Elizabeth wouldn't want you to keep yourself locked away forever." Quentin bristled at the mention of his wife's name. "I'm not here for a lecture, Dan." The sheriff raised his hands in surrender. "No lecture, just good to see you is all." He changed the subject. "You met our new school teacher yet? Miss Montgomery arrived from Boston last week. Fine young lady. Whole town's talking about her." "We've met," Quentin said, not elaborating. "Have you now?" Daniel's eyebrows rose with interest. "When was that?" "Yesterday evening, at the cemetery." The sheriff's expression grew serious. "Ah, the anniversary." Quentin nodded once, not trusting his voice. "Well," Daniel continued, "Miss Montgomery's already making quite an impression. Mayor's wife has taken her under her wing. She's staying at the boarding house until the teachers' quarters behind the school are finished." Before Quentin could respond, the door to the mercantile opened, and Aurora herself stepped out onto the boardwalk, a paper-wrapped package in her arms. Today, she wore a simple green dress that matched her eyes, her hair again tied back with a ribbon. "Miss Montgomery," Sheriff Harrington called, tipping his hat. "Allow me to properly introduce you to one of Wheatland's most prominent citizens. This is Quentin Mills of the Lucky Strike Ranch, best cattle operation in the county." Aurora's eyes lit with recognition. "Mr. Mills and I have met, Sheriff. Good afternoon to you both." Her smile was warm but reserved. "Miss Montgomery," Quentin managed, touching the brim of his hat. "Miss Montgomery has been quite the topic of conversation," Daniel continued. "Not just for her teaching credentials, but for her work in the cemetery. Never seen anything like it." A touch of color appeared on Aurora's cheeks. "It's nothing remarkable, Sheriff, just a small gesture of respect." "I think it's more than that," Daniel insisted. "Most folks avoid that section of the cemetery entirely. Too many sad stories, too many forgotten names." Perhaps that's precisely why they deserve our attention, Aurora replied quietly. Something in her tone silenced both men momentarily. Well, Aurora said, breaking the uncomfortable pause, I should get these supplies back to Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. It was nice seeing you again, Mr. Mills. Sheriff. As she walked away, Sheriff Harrington gave Quentin a curious look. Interesting lady. Got half the town talking about her cemetery visits. Some find it odd, others think it's admirable. And what do you think? Quentin asked, his eyes still following Aurora's retreating figure. I think this town could use more people who care about the forgotten, Daniel replied. Don't you? The question followed Quentin through his errands and back to his ranch. That evening, he found himself once again drawn to the cemetery as twilight approached. He told himself he was going to visit Elizabeth and Thomas, but his steps took him to the northwestern corner where the unmarked graves stood in silent rows. Aurora was there again, this time planting different flowers, small white blooms that seemed to glow in the fading light. Evening, Miss Montgomery, Quentin said, approaching slowly. She looked up, seemingly unsurprised by his appearance. Mr. Mills, please call me Aurora. Only if you'll call me Quentin, she nodded, returning to her task. He watched her work for several minutes, noticing the care with which she treated each grave, as if the identity of the person beneath mattered deeply to her. May I ask why you're doing this? He finally asked. These people, they're strangers to you. Aurora sat back on her heels, considering his question. When I was a child, my mother died of pneumonia while we were traveling west. We were in a small town in Ohio, far from home. My father had to continue our journey, so we left her there, buried in a strange place. She paused, her hand still in her lap. I've always wondered if anyone ever puts flowers on her grave, so now I do this, thinking that perhaps someone is doing the same for her. The simple explanation hit Quentin with unexpected force. I'm sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago, Aurora replied. I was only 10, but I still remember how it felt to leave her behind. Quentin knelt beside her, examining the delicate white flowers she was planting. What are these? Asters. They represent remembrance. She offered him one of the small plants. Would you like to help? Quentin hesitated. The idea of caring for graves other than his family's seemed somehow like a betrayal. Yet something in Aurora's quiet invitation called to him. I wouldn't know what to do, he admitted. It's simple, she said, demonstrating with her trowel. Just a small hole, place the roots inside, cover them with soil and give them a bit of water. After another moment's hesitation, Quentin took off his gloves and accepted the trowel and plant. Following her instructions, he carefully placed the aster beside an unmarked stone, his large hands feeling clumsy at the delicate work. Perfect, Aurora encouraged when he'd finished. You've just honored someone who might otherwise have been forgotten. They worked side by side as the daylight faded, Quentin finding an unexpected peace in the simple act of planting flowers for people he'd never known. As darkness fell, they packed up Aurora's tools in companionable silence. Thank you for your help, she said as they walked toward town. It goes faster with two people. It was calming, Quentin admitted. I haven't felt calm in a long time. Aurora studied him in the gathering darkness. Grief is its own kind of wilderness, isn't it? You can get lost in it so easily. The perceptiveness of her observation startled him. Yes, he agreed. That's exactly what it's like. They reached the edge of town, where light spilled from the windows of the saloon and hotel. Would you like to join me for supper at the hotel restaurant? Quentin found himself asking. As thanks for letting me help. Aurora seemed surprised by the invitation. That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose on your evening. You wouldn't be, he assured her. Truth is, I haven't had a proper conversation with anyone in months. Might do me good. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. In that case, I'd be delighted, thank you. The hotel restaurant was quiet for a Tuesday evening with only a few tables occupied. The hostess led them to a corner table, her eyebrows rising slightly at seeing Quentin with company. People are staring, Aurora noted after they were seated. Small town, Quentin explained, and I haven't exactly been sociable lately. Grief can be isolating, she observed, unfolding her napkin. After my mother died, my father retreated into himself for nearly 2 years. It was as if he'd gone away too, even though he was still physically present. Quentin nodded, recognizing his own behavior in her description. It's hard to see the point in connecting with others when the ones you love can be taken so suddenly. Yet here you are, Aurora pointed out gently. The waiter arrived to take their orders, providing Quentin a moment to consider her words. Why was he here, sharing a meal with a woman he barely knew? Something about Aurora's quiet strength and her mission to honor the forgotten had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. Over a simple meal of roast beef and potatoes, they talked. Aurora told him about growing up in Boston with her father, a professor of literature, and her decision to become a teacher. Quentin shared stories of establishing his ranch 10 years earlier, when Wheatland was barely more than a few buildings and a lot of promise. How did you meet your wife? Aurora asked as they lingered over coffee. The question might have seemed intrusive coming from anyone else, but Aurora's genuine interest made it feel natural to answer. Elizabeth was the daughter of a rancher over in Cheyenne. We met at a harvest dance when I was just starting out with Lucky Strike. Quentin smiled at the memory. She was the prettiest girl there, but what I remember most was how she laughed like she meant it, not just to be polite. We were married 6 months later. She sounds wonderful, Aurora said softly. She was, Quentin agreed. We had 7 good years together before. He trailed off, the familiar ache returning. And your son, Thomas, was just 6 months old when the fever took them both. Quentin's voice grew rough. He had her eyes. Aurora reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. Thank you for telling me about them. It honors their memory to speak their names. The simple observation struck Quentin deeply. He'd avoided talking about Elizabeth and Thomas for so long, as if speaking about them would somehow make their absence more real. Yet sharing these small details with Aurora felt not like reopening a wound, but like applying a healing balm. As they left the restaurant, the summer night had cooled to a pleasant temperature. Quentin offered to walk Aurora back to her boarding house. Thank you for supper, she said as they strolled along Wheatland's main street, and for sharing your family with me. Thank you for listening, he replied, and for showing me a different way to look at remembrance. They reached Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with a small porch. Aurora paused at the steps. Will I see you tomorrow at the cemetery? She asked. Quentin considered the question. Yesterday, the idea of returning to plant flowers for strangers would have seemed pointless. Now he found himself looking forward to it. Yes, he said, I'll be there. Aurora smiled, the expression warming her entire face. Good night, Quentin. Good night, Aurora. As he walked back to where his horse was hitched, Quentin realized he felt lighter than he had in months. The crushing weight of grief was still there, but somehow it had shifted slightly, making room for something new to grow alongside it. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Each evening, Quentin would finish his ranch work and ride into town to meet Aurora at the cemetery. Together, they would plant flowers on the unmarked graves, sometimes talking, sometimes working in companionable silence. Afterward, they would share a meal at the hotel restaurant or occasionally at the small cafe that had opened near the train station. Gradually, Quentin began to learn Aurora's story. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her alone in Boston. The teaching position in Wheatland had offered a fresh start in a place where she could make a difference. "The children here deserve a good education," she explained one evening as they planted purple coneflowers. "Many of them will never travel beyond Wyoming. Books can show them the wider world." "You could have taught anywhere," Quentin observed. "Why choose a small town like Wheatland?" Aurora carefully patted soil around a freshly planted flower before answering. "Cities have plenty of teachers. It's the small towns that truly need them." She glanced up at him. "Besides, there's a certain honesty to life here that I find appealing. In Boston, everything feels constrained by expectations and social rules." Quentin chuckled. "We have plenty of rules and expectations here too. They're just different ones." "True," she conceded with a smile. "But at least here I can plant flowers in a cemetery without causing a scandal. In Boston, people would think I'd lost my mind." Their easy conversation was a balm to Quentin's wounded spirit. He found himself looking forward to their evenings together, planning his day around their meeting time. The ranch hands had noticed the change in him, though they were wise enough not to comment directly. His foreman, Jim Collins, merely nodded approvingly when Quentin started taking an active interest in the ranch operations again. On a particularly warm evening in late July, they finished their planting earlier than usual. The section of unmarked graves now boasted colorful blooms of various types, transforming what had been a desolate corner of the cemetery into a place of unexpected beauty. "It's amazing how different it looks now," Quentin observed, surveying their work. "It is," Aurora agreed, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Though we'll need to water these daily with this heat, I fear some won't survive otherwise." Quentin considered the problem. "I could bring a barrel of water in my wagon tomorrow, rig up a simple irrigation system." Aurora's face brightened at the suggestion. "That would be wonderful. I've been carrying buckets from the creek, but it's not enough in this weather." "Consider it done," Quentin promised. "Now, would you like to try something different for supper tonight? I make a decent stew if you're willing to ride out to the ranch." The invitation surprised them both. Quentin hadn't entertained anyone at his home since the funeral, when neighbors had brought food and sympathy in equal measure. Aurora hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that very much, though I should let Mrs. Peterson know not to expect me." They stopped by the boarding house, where Aurora quickly informed her landlady of her dinner plans. Mrs. Peterson, a plump, friendly widow in her 50s, gave Quentin an appraising look before nodding her approval. "Just be back before it gets too late, dear," she instructed Aurora. "Though I expect Mr. Mills is perfectly trustworthy." The slight emphasis on perfectly suggested that while she approved, she was also watching carefully. The ride to Lucky Strike took about 20 minutes at an easy pace. Aurora rode the gentle mare she'd purchased upon arriving in Wheatland, explaining that she'd grown up riding in the countryside outside Boston. "My father thought every proper young lady should know how to ride," she said as they crested a hill that revealed the full expanse of Quentin's property. She pulled her horse to a stop, taking in the view. "Oh, Quentin, it's beautiful." The Lucky Strike spread across nearly 2,000 acres of prime Wyoming rangeland. The main house and outbuildings formed a neat cluster near a creek that provided year-round water, with cattle grazing on the rolling hills beyond. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, making the scene look like something from a painting. "Elizabeth chose this spot for the house," Quentin said, a bittersweet pride in his voice. "She said we needed to be able to see the whole ranch from our front porch." They rode down to the main house, a sturdy 2-story structure built of local timber and stone. Several ranch hands were finishing their day's work around the barn and corrals. They tipped their hats respectfully as Quentin helped Aurora dismount. "Evening, boss," called Jim Collins, approaching to take their horses. "Miss Montgomery, nice to see you out here." "Thank you, Mr. Collins," Aurora replied. She'd met the foreman in town several times and had made a favorable impression with her practical nature and lack of airs. "Anything need my attention before morning, Jim?" Quentin asked. "Nothing that can't wait," Collins assured him. "You two enjoy your evening." Inside, the house was simply but comfortably furnished. Quentin lit several lamps, illuminating a large main room that served as both parlor and dining area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it sat cold in the summer heat. "This is lovely," Aurora said, running her hand along the back of a well-crafted chair. "Did you build it yourself?" "Most of it," Quentin confirmed. "Had help with the stonework and some of the finer carpentry." He moved toward the kitchen. "Make yourself comfortable, I'll get supper started." "May I help?" Aurora asked, following him. "I'm a fair cook myself." Together they prepared a simple meal of beef stew, fresh bread that Mrs. Collins, the foreman's wife, had sent over that morning, and a cherry pie that Quentin admitted he'd purchased from the hotel restaurant, knowing Aurora was partial to cherries. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Quentin was struck by how natural it felt to have Aurora in his home. For the first time since losing Elizabeth and Thomas, the house didn't feel empty, it felt alive again. They ate at the large oak table in the main room, the open windows allowing a cool evening breeze to offset the summer heat. Quentin found himself sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, the challenges and triumphs of building something from nothing. "You've accomplished so much," Aurora observed. "You should be proud." "I was," Quentin admitted. "Then when I lost Elizabeth and Thomas, it all seemed pointless. I couldn't see why any of it mattered anymore." Aurora nodded, understanding. "And now," Quentin considered the question carefully, "now, I'm starting to remember why we built this place, not just for ourselves, but because we believed in creating something lasting." He met her eyes across the table. "Your work in the cemetery reminded me of that honoring what's past is part of building a future." A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their meal. Afterward, Quentin suggested they sit on the front porch to enjoy the evening air. The porch faced west, offering a spectacular view of the sunset painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. They sat in matching rocking chairs, watching as the day gave way to night and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. "I used to come out here every evening with Elizabeth," Quentin said softly. "After Thomas was born, she'd hold him and tell him stories about all the places the stars shine down on." "What a beautiful tradition," Aurora replied. "A way of connecting him to the wider world." "I haven't sat out here since." Quentin's voice caught. "This is the first time I've watched the sunset from this porch in a year." Aurora reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Quentin looked down at their joined hands, then up at Aurora's face, softly illuminated in the gathering darkness. The impulse to kiss her came suddenly and powerfully, surprising him with its intensity. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. "It's getting late. I should get you back to town before Mrs. Peterson sends the sheriff after us." Aurora nodded, a hint of regret in her smile. "Yes, I suppose we should go." The ride back to Wheatland was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. At the boarding house, Quentin helped Aurora dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for tonight," she said, looking up at him. "For dinner and for sharing your home with me." "Thank you for helping me remember that it is still a home," he replied. In the soft glow of the porch light, Aurora stood on tiptoe and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. "Good night, Quentin." "Good night, Aurora." As he rode back to Lucky Strike, Quentin's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. The grief for Elizabeth and Thomas was still there, a constant presence in his heart. But alongside it, something new was growing: feelings for Aurora that he couldn't deny, even if he wasn't yet ready to fully acknowledge them. The next day, true to his word, Quentin brought a wagon with a large water barrel to the cemetery. With Aurora's help, he rigged a simple irrigation system using leather hoses and wooden troughs that would slowly deliver water to each section of newly planted flowers. "This is ingenious," Aurora exclaimed as they tested the system, watching as water trickled evenly along the rows of graves. "Just a simple adaptation of how we water the vegetable garden at the ranch," Quentin explained, pleased by her reaction. "It should keep everything alive through the August heat." As they worked, Quentin noticed a small group of townspeople watching from the cemetery entrance. Sheriff Harrington was among them, along with Mayor Wilson and his wife. "Seems we have an audience," he murmured to Aurora. She glanced up, waving to the onlookers. "They've been curious about the flowers for weeks. Mrs. Wilson asked me about it at church on Sunday." To Quentin's surprise, the small group approached rather than dispersing. Mayor Wilson, a portly man with an impressive mustache, led the way. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Mills," he greeted them. "Quite an operation you've got going here." "Just ensuring the flowers survive the summer heat," Aurora explained. Mrs. Wilson, a tall woman with kind eyes, surveyed the transformed section of cemetery. "It's remarkable what you've accomplished. This area has been neglected for as long as I can remember." "That's why I started planting," Aurora said. "Every life deserves to be remembered." "A noble sentiment," the mayor agreed, "and one that's inspired others, it seems." Sheriff Harrington nodded. "Several folks have mentioned wanting to help, the Ladies' Aid Society in particular." Quentin and Aurora exchanged surprised glances. "Help would be wonderful," Aurora said. "There's still much to do before winter comes. We thought perhaps a community effort this Saturday, Mrs. Wilson suggested. Many hands make light work after all. And so it was arranged. Word spread quickly through Wheatland that Saturday would be a day for honoring the cemetery's forgotten souls. Quentin found himself unexpectedly appointed co-organizer alongside Aurora, planning what supplies would be needed and how many people they could reasonably accommodate. Saturday dawned clear and bright, a perfect late July day. Quentin arrived at the cemetery early to find Aurora already there, setting out tools and plants she'd purchased with funds donated by the Ladies' Aid Society. "You're up with the sun," he observed, helping her arrange buckets of water along the rows of graves. "Too excited to sleep," she admitted with a smile. "I never expected this to become a community project." By 9 o'clock, townspeople began arriving in family groups. Children carried small plants or flower seeds, women brought picnic baskets for a midday meal, and men came with tools for clearing weeds and improving the irrigation system Quentin had devised. Reverend Thomas offered a simple prayer before the work began, asking blessings on both those being remembered and those doing the remembering. Then, under Aurora and Quentin's guidance, the people of Wheatland set to work transforming the neglected corner of their cemetery. Throughout the morning, Quentin found himself moving between groups, showing children how to properly plant flowers, helping older men set up additional water barrels, and occasionally catching Aurora's eye across the busy scene. Each time their gazes met, a warm understanding passed between them. This was something they had created together. During the midday meal, spread on blankets throughout the cemetery, Quentin sat with Aurora under the shade of an old cottonwood tree. All around them, the people of Wheatland chatted and laughed, the summer setting transformed by their presence into a place of community and connection. "You've changed this town," Quentin said quietly to Aurora. "In just a few weeks." She shook her head. "We've changed it together. I just planted a few flowers. You helped it grow into something more." Before Quentin could respond, Mrs. Wilson approached them, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Mills, the most extraordinary thing has happened." Mr. Jeffries from the newspaper was looking through old records for a story about the town's founding, and he found a ledger from the fever epidemic of '69. It contains names and details of many who were buried in the unmarked section. Aurora gasped. "Truly? Oh, that's wonderful news." "He's bringing the records this afternoon," Mrs. Wilson continued. "We may be able to identify many of these graves after all." By late afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. Every unmarked grave now boasted flowers or small plants. The irrigation system had been expanded and improved, and wooden pathways had been laid between rows to allow for easier access and maintenance. Mr. Jeffries, the editor of the Wheatland Gazette, arrived with the promised ledger, and a small committee formed to begin the process of identifying graves and creating proper markers. Aurora was unanimously appointed to head this committee, with Quentin asked to assist given his knowledge of local history. As the day wound down and families began heading home, satisfied with their collective accomplishment, Quentin and Aurora stood together surveying the results of their inspiration. "I never imagined this would happen when I planted that first yellow flower," Aurora said, wonder in her voice. "You sparked something this town needed," Quentin replied. "A way to honor its past while building community for the future." In the golden light of late afternoon, surrounded by the evidence of what caring and commitment could accomplish, Quentin made a decision. Taking Aurora's hand in his, he turned to face her. "Would you join me for dinner at my ranch again tomorrow evening? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Aurora's eyes searched his face, seeming to understand the significance of his invitation. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that very much." That night, as Quentin rode back to Lucky Strike, his heart felt lighter than it had in a year. The grief for Elizabeth and Thomas would always be part of him, but Aurora had shown him that honoring their memory didn't mean living in the past. It meant carrying their love forward into a future that could still hold meaning and joy. Sunday evening arrived with a gentle summer rain, the first in weeks. Quentin had spent the day preparing for Aurora's visit, cleaning the house more thoroughly than he had in months, and preparing a special meal with Mrs. Collins's help. Aurora arrived promptly at 6, wearing a pretty blue dress that brought out the green of her eyes. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "For you," she said, handing it to Quentin after he'd helped her remove her damp cloak. "A small thank you for everything you've done." Curious, Quentin unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a simple design of mountains and stars. "Open it," Aurora encouraged. Inside, on the first page, she had written in elegant script, "For Quentin Mills, who helped remember the forgotten and found a way forward. With deepest appreciation, Aurora Montgomery." Touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, Quentin looked up to find Aurora watching him nervously. "I thought perhaps you might want to write down stories of Elizabeth and Thomas," she explained. "So they'll always be remembered, not just in your heart, but in words that could someday be shared." Quentin ran his fingers over the beautiful book, his throat tight with emotion. "This is perfect. Thank you." The evening unfolded comfortably, with a delicious meal of roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the ranch garden, and a blueberry cobbler that Mrs. Collins had insisted on making when she heard Aurora was coming to dinner. As they ate, they discussed the progress on identifying the unmarked graves. Mr. Jeffries's ledger had already provided names for nearly 20 of them, and plans were underway to create proper markers. The town council has approved funds for simple headstones, Aurora reported. And several families who recognized ancestors in the ledger have offered to contribute more elaborate markers. It's remarkable how quickly this has all happened, Quentin observed. People wanted to help, Aurora said. They just needed a way to do it. After dinner, the rain having stopped, Quentin suggested a short walk to show Aurora his favorite view of the ranch. They strolled together along a gentle rise behind the house, the evening air fresh and clean after the rain. At the top of the rise stood a lone cottonwood tree, its branches spreading wide against the twilight sky. Beneath it, Quentin had placed a simple wooden bench years ago. "Elizabeth and I used to come here in the evenings," he explained as they sat side by side. "You can see the whole ranch from this spot." Below them, Lucky Strike spread out in a patchwork of fields and pastures, with cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. The main house and outbuildings looked warm and inviting, lanterns glowing in windows as darkness gathered. "It's beautiful," Aurora said softly. "You've built something special here, Quentin." "I thought I'd lost the heart of it when Elizabeth and Thomas died," he admitted. "The ranch kept going. Cattle don't care if your heart's broken, but the purpose of it all seemed gone." Aurora waited quietly, sensing he had more to say. "Then I met you," Quentin continued, turning to face her. "Planting flowers for people you'd never known, honoring lives you had no connection to except through our common humanity. It made me remember why any of this matters, why we build things, why we remember, why we keep going." He took her hands in his heart pounding in his chest. "Aurora, I know it's been just a few weeks, and I know that loving someone comes with the risk of losing them. But you've shown me that the risk is worth taking, that honoring the past doesn't mean giving up on the future." Aurora's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she listened. "I'm not asking for promises right now," Quentin clarified. "Just permission to court you properly. To see if what I feel growing between us might blossom into something as beautiful as those flowers we've planted together." A single tear spilled down Aurora's cheek as she squeezed his hands. "Quentin, I came to Wheatland looking for a fresh start, a place to build something meaningful after losing my father. I never expected to find someone who would understand both my grief and my hope." Her voice grew stronger. "Yes, I would be honored to be courted by you." Relief and joy flooded through Quentin. Gently, he reached up to brush away her tear with his thumb, then leaned forward and kissed her. The kiss was soft and sweet, a promise of possibilities rather than a demand. When they parted, Aurora's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I think Elizabeth would approve, don't you?" she asked gently. The question might have pained him coming from anyone else, but from Aurora it felt right. "Yes," he said with certainty. "She always said life was for living even when it hurts, especially then." They sat together under the cottonwood tree until the stars came out, talking about possibilities and plans, honoring the past while looking toward the future. The weeks that followed were the happiest Quentin had known since losing his family. He and Aurora fell into a comfortable rhythm, with him coming into town several evenings a week to help with the cemetery project or to take her to dinner, and Aurora riding out to the ranch on Sundays after church. August turned to September, and the schoolhouse was finally ready for the start of the term. Aurora threw herself into preparing for her students, while Quentin focused on the fall roundup at the ranch. Despite their busy schedules, they made time for each other, their connection deepening with each passing day. On the Sunday before school was to begin, Quentin invited Aurora to the ranch for a special dinner. He had something important to ask her, though he was careful not to reveal his intentions beforehand. Aurora arrived looking radiant in a new dress of deep green, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant style that framed her face beautifully. "You look stunning," Quentin said, helping her down from her horse. She smiled, a hint of color rising to her cheeks. "Thank you. It seems like ages since we've had an evening together with all the preparations for school." "Too long," Quentin agreed, offering his arm to escort her into the house. Inside, he had prepared everything carefully. The table was set with Elizabeth's good china, which he'd retrieved from storage for the first time since her death. Fresh wildflowers from the meadow beyond the house formed a centerpiece, and candles cast a warm glow over the room. "This is beautiful," Aurora exclaimed, taking in the scene. "What's the occasion?" "Let's save that for after dinner," Quentin suggested with a smile. Throughout the meal, they talked about Aurora's plans for her students and Quentin's progress with the fall roundup. It felt natural and right, as if they'd been sharing their days with each other for years rather than months. After dessert, Quentin suggested they move to the parlor, where a small fire warded off the September evening chill. Once they were settled on the sofa, he took Aurora's hand in his. "These past 2 months have been the happiest I've known in a very long time," he began. "You came into my life when I thought happiness was behind me, and you showed me that the heart can heal without forgetting." Aurora squeezed his hand encouragingly, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I know it hasn't been long," Quentin continued, "but I also know what I feel for you is real and lasting." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Aurora Montgomery, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Opening the box, he revealed a ring with a single pearl surrounded by small diamonds. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "Elizabeth wore it for our engagement, and I think she would want you to have it now." Aurora's eyes filled with tears as she looked from the ring to Quentin's face. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "Truly certain?" "More certain than I've been about anything since the day I decided to build this ranch," he assured her. "I love you, Aurora. I want to build a future with you." A radiant smile broke across her face. "Then yes, Quentin Mills. Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that spoke of all the love and hope in his heart. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears of joy. "When?" Aurora asked, admiring the ring on her finger. "When should we be married?" "I was thinking before winter sets in," Quentin suggested. "Perhaps early November after harvest, but before the heavy snows. Unless you'd prefer to wait until spring?" Aurora shook her head. "November sounds perfect. It gives us time to prepare without waiting too long." They spent the remainder of the evening planning their future together. Aurora would continue teaching through the school year, then decide whether to return for another term or focus on helping Quentin run the ranch. They would live at Lucky Strike, with occasional stays in town when weather made travel difficult. As Quentin rode Aurora back to the boarding house that night, the stars seemed especially bright above them, as if blessing their engagement. At the door, he kissed her once more, reluctant to part even for the few hours until morning. "I'll come by the school tomorrow afternoon," he promised. "We can tell Mrs. Peterson and announce our engagement to the town council at their meeting tomorrow evening." Aurora nodded, her face glowing with happiness. Until tomorrow, then. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Wheatland. Most townsfolk received the news with genuine pleasure, having witnessed the positive changes in Quentin since Aurora's arrival and appreciating her contributions to the community. The cemetery project continued to flourish under their joint leadership. By mid-October, nearly half of the unmarked graves had been identified and proper headstones ordered. The town had officially designated a small fund for the ongoing maintenance of the area, ensuring that Aurora's initial act of remembrance would have lasting impact. Wedding preparations progressed smoothly, with Mrs. Wilson and several other prominent women in town insisting on helping Aurora with the details. The ceremony would be held in Wheatland's small church, followed by a reception at the town hall. Quentin, meanwhile, worked with Jim Collins to ensure the ranch would run smoothly during the week-long honeymoon they planned to take in Cheyenne. 2 weeks before the wedding, as Quentin was making final arrangements for the honeymoon, he received an unexpected letter. It was from Elizabeth's sister in Cheyenne, responding to the news of his engagement that he'd sent a month earlier. Margaret's letter was warm and supportive, expressing her happiness that Quentin had found love again and her desire to meet Aurora. Then, near the end, came the surprise. "I have kept something of Elizabeth's that I think should now be yours, or rather, Aurora's. When Elizabeth visited us the summer before she fell ill, she brought a journal containing letters she'd written to you and Thomas, to be read in the event of her passing. She said she hoped you'd never need them, but wanted them to exist just in case." At the time, it seemed a morbid precaution, but now I see it as a final gift from my sister's loving heart. "I will bring it when I come for your wedding." Quentin sat for a long time with the letter in his hands, emotions washing over him in waves. Elizabeth, practical and forward-thinking as always, had prepared for a possibility she'd hoped would never come to pass. The thought of reading her words after all this time was both painful and precious. That evening, he rode into town to share the news with Aurora. They sat together in the small parlor of the boarding house, Margaret's letter between them on the table. "How do you feel about this?" Aurora asked gently. Quentin considered the question carefully. "Grateful," he finally said. "Grateful that Elizabeth thought to leave her words behind, and grateful to have someone like you to share them with." Aurora reached across the table to take his hand. "We'll read them together if you like, or you can read them privately first, whatever feels right to you." Her understanding touched him deeply. Together, he decided. Elizabeth would want her words to help build our future, not keep me tied to the past. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of final preparations. Margaret arrived from Cheyenne 3 days before the ceremony, bringing with her the journal Elizabeth had entrusted to her. She and Aurora took to each other immediately, forming a bond that Quentin knew would only strengthen with time. The evening before their wedding, after the rehearsal dinner had concluded and guests had dispersed to their various accommodations, Quentin and Aurora sat together in his study at Lucky Strike. Margaret was staying in one of the guest rooms, while Aurora had one last night at the boarding house before moving to the ranch permanently. Between them on the desk sat Elizabeth's journal, bound in soft blue leather and tied with a ribbon. "Are you ready?" Aurora asked softly. Quentin nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, it's time." Together, they untied the ribbon and opened the journal. On the first page, in Elizabeth's neat handwriting, was a letter addressed to Quentin. "My dearest Quentin, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Know that whatever took me from you, my last thoughts were of you and our precious Thomas. I write these words not to burden you with grief, but to free you from it. Remember me, love, but do not let memory become a cage. The life we built together was a gift, and gifts are meant to bring joy, not sorrow. When you are ready, and only you will know when that time comes, I hope you will find love again. Someone who sees your strength and your gentleness, who challenges you and supports you as I have tried to do. Someone who will love our son and help him remember me without living in my shadow. Know that you have my blessing. The heart expands to love again. It does not replace what was lost. Whoever she may be, I thank her for bringing light back into your life and our sons. Live fully, love deeply, and plant those apple trees we talked about along the North Ridge. I expect they'll be bearing fruit by the time we meet again in whatever lies beyond this life. All my love, now and always. Elizabeth. Tears streamed down Quentin's face as he finished reading. Aurora, her own eyes wet, slipped her arm around his shoulders and held him as years of guilt and grief were washed away by Elizabeth's final gift of understanding. She knew, Quentin whispered. Somehow, she knew I would need these words. She loved you deeply, Aurora said. Enough to want your happiness above all else. They spent the next hour reading through the journal. Some pages contained memories Elizabeth had wanted to preserve for Thomas the day he was born, the first time he smiled, hopes she had for his future. Others held practical advice for Quentin about running the household and raising their son. Throughout, her voice was clear and loving, reaching across time to offer comfort and guidance. When they finished, Quentin carefully closed the journal and retied the ribbon. Tomorrow, when we exchange our vows, I'll do so knowing that Elizabeth approves. It's more than I could have hoped for. Aurora kissed him gently. 3 hearts brought us together, yours, mine, and hers. What a remarkable foundation for a marriage. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, a perfect early November day. The ceremony at Wheatland's church was simple but deeply meaningful. Aurora, radiant in a gown of ivory satin with pearl accents that complemented her engagement ring, carried a bouquet of the same yellow flowers she'd been planting the day Quentin first met her. Reverend Thomas spoke eloquently about love that honors the past while embracing the future, words that resonated deeply with the couple and their guests. When it came time for their vows, Quentin and Aurora had each prepared their own, speaking from the heart about the journey that had brought them together. Aurora, Quentin said, his voice strong and clear, when I found you planting flowers on unknown graves, I was lost in grief, unable to see beyond my pain. You showed me that remembering those we've lost can be an act of love rather than sorrow. You helped me honor the past without being trapped by it. He squeezed her hands gently. I promise to love you with all that I am, to build our future together while cherishing the memories that shaped us, and to plant flowers with you for as long as we both shall live. Aurora's eyes shone with tears as she spoke her vows in return. Quentin, when we met, I was searching for meaning in a world that had taken too much from both of us. In you, I found not only love, but purpose, a shared understanding that every life deserves to be remembered and honored. I promise to walk beside you through all the seasons of our lives, to nurture the love between us as carefully as we've tended those forgotten graves, and to help you see the beauty in each sunrise, even on the darkest days. As they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and a few happy tears. The reception that followed was joyous and lively, with the entire town turning out to celebrate the union of 2 people who had brought such positive change to their community. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Quentin led Aurora outside to a quiet spot beneath the stars. From the town hall, they could see the cemetery on its gentle rise, the once neglected corner now transformed into a place of beauty and remembrance. Thank you, Quentin said simply, drawing Aurora close. For what? She asked, looking up at him with love. For planting those first flowers, for showing me how to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, for becoming my wife. Aurora reached up to touch his face gently. And thank you for seeing me that day, for joining me in remembering the forgotten, for being brave enough to love again. Under the vast Wyoming sky, surrounded by the love of their community, and blessed by the memory of those who had gone before, Quentin and Aurora sealed their new beginning with a kiss that promised a lifetime of remembering and honoring, of growing and loving together. Over the years that followed, their love only deepened. Aurora continued teaching at the Wheatland school for 2 more years before deciding to focus on helping Quentin run the ranch and raise their growing family. Their first child, a son they named James, arrived a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by twin daughters they called Margaret and Elizabeth. The cemetery project became a permanent part of Wheatland's community life, with annual planting days and regular maintenance overseen by a committee that Aurora continued to chair even as her other responsibilities multiplied. Eventually, every unmarked grave received identification and a proper headstone, transforming what had once been a place of forgotten souls into a testament to the town's commitment to remembering its past. Quentin planted those apple trees Elizabeth had mentioned in her letter, and by the time James was old enough to climb them, they were indeed bearing fruit. On summer evenings, the family would often gather beneath the cottonwood tree on the rise behind the house, watching the sunset over Lucky Strike while Quentin and Aurora told stories of those who had come before Elizabeth and Thomas, Aurora's parents, and the countless unnamed individuals whose lives they had helped honor through flowers and remembrance. As the children grew, they came to understand that their family had been formed not despite loss, but through the courage to honor grief while still reaching for joy, through the simple act of planting flowers on forgotten graves and the profound love that had grown from that tender beginning. And each spring, when the first wildflowers bloomed across the Wyoming rangeland, Quentin and Aurora would walk hand in hand through the cemetery, remembering how their story began and giving thanks for the love that had transformed their lives and their community, one flower at a time.